let's bring on our presenters for today. We have Richard Beaver, Gagan Kerr, Alex Merck. All three will be speaking, and Richard will start us off.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us for this conversation. As Kara mentioned, if you do have questions, feel free to throw them up and we will get to them as we can. So we just wanted to kind of spend a little bit of time today talking about a few things with regards to STINGAR. You know, I noticed that several folks joining are maybe familiar with it. And for those that aren't, we'll give you a brief background of it. We'll also be speaking to kind of what we've been doing recently with architecture, as well as some new features that we've been baking into the framework. And then lastly, taking a look at some of the data and some of the insights we're gleaning from the intelligence that's being collected by the different STINGAR partners. So very quickly here, let's see here. If I can get PowerPoint to, there we go. Just very quickly, as Karen mentioned, the material that the work here is based on was supported by 2 National Science Foundation grants. Would like to acknowledge their support for this effort. And with that being said, you know, kind of get into this a little bit. So STINGAR, or Shared Threat Intelligence and Network Gatekeeping with Automated Response, really is comprised of 3 parts, right? And it's designed to make it easy for higher ed institutions to collect data using honeypots, take action on that data by sending the data to other tools in your environment, such as an intrusion prevention system or a firewall or black hole router, and then also share that information with trusted partners. So when we look at some of these processes here, we do look at it as far as from the collection space. We have 2 different types of honeypots. Low interaction, that is, if you touch the honeypot, then we're going to take action immediately, all the way up through a high interaction style honeypot, which allows for us to collect additional data in terms of what the attacker is doing within that environment. You know, what commands are they running, what URLs are they visiting, things like that. From a blocking perspective, we do support real-time ingest. We have found this to be very effective for large-scale scanning. And the last thing we would note is, from a detection standpoint, the data has been very useful. We have found both for Duke as well as other partners in terms of doing look back. So if something bad has happened, see if there's any indicators there that show that the attacker might have been there all along. From a sharing perspective, the STINGAR framework is based off the Collective Intelligence Framework. For those of you that participate in some of the ISAC programs, you may be familiar with this. We do export and import data via feeds, and we also support raw sharing. So if you or your institution are interested in the raw data from the honeypots, that is something that can be easily gathered. This could be of interest, particularly if you're working with research groups. So at the end of the day, we often start from the standpoint of, well, why should we participate, right? What are the benefits? And we typically talk a little bit about what our experience has been. We actually started this way back in 2014. You know, the initial kind of effort on this, and it was started largely because of 2 things. Commercial threat intelligence products were too pricey and were not actionable enough. Sometimes it didn't apply to us, or sometimes it took too long to get actionable information into place. And the other thing is, the commercial network security tools took too long to move block lists into place. So we figured out making use of our own log data at first, and then moving on from that into using honeypots to generate data. We could generate very interesting, specific information to our environment that we also had very low rate of false positives. So by the time that this was up and really going as something that was viable, this was right at the heart of the Mirai botnet. And so we leveled off, you know, somewhere between somewhere around two and a half billion blocks per day that we were seeing this tool take care of. The other key thing from our perspective and operational perspective was just the reduction in intrusion prevention alerts. To be very clear, this is not a substitute for a commercial tool, but what it did do is take a lot of the noise off of our tool sets and enabled us to focus on things that were much more interesting. And then over, you know, thanks to the NSF grants and the partnership with the ResearchSOC and our other higher ed partners, we were able to make continuous improvements to the environment so that we had something that was low cost, it's low friction to get into place, has a flexible design associated with it, you know, either using VMs or in most cases, Docker containers to make it easy to deploy, real-time sharing of data, easy to take malicious traffic off your network. A little bit later on, Alex will speak to one method to do this using black hole routing. And then, of course, supporting research. We have had a couple of use cases so far in which researchers have been very interested in looking and seeing how the data might be used in their research efforts. So with that being said, I'm going to hand this off to Alex, who's going to walk us through the architecture and some of the new work going on here.
Thanks, Richard. So as Richard mentioned previously, one of the primary goals of the STINGAR project is to allow partners to quickly share threat intelligence indicators using honeypots. And this is, you know, both sharing that data to other partners as well as ingesting some of that data for use in their own environment. So as Richard mentioned earlier, STINGAR is fairly flexible. So we've attempted to design this to be, you know, modular and to work in various environments. So if you're, you know, running different IDS, IPS infrastructure, it can be easily incorporated into your existing architecture. That being said, the primary method that people generally use STINGAR is to spin up CHN servers. So CHN server is essentially the central honeypot management and log collection application. So, you know, each participating partner would run this in their environment. It's fairly lightweight. And then all of their honeypots would connect back to their CHN server. This can be used to, you know, submit indicators to that shared threat repository, or take other actions such as, you know, logging to some sort of logging server, or, you know, blocking that traffic via BHR or an IPS system. Next slide. So as mentioned before, honeypots are the primary sensor used to produce threat intelligence in STINGAR. These honeypots include a mixture of high interaction and low interaction honeypots. So an example here of a high interaction honeypot would be Cowrie or Spylegs. These are honeypots that are designed to fully and accurately service, allowing an attacker to log in, run commands, and interact with the application as they would a legitimate service. On the other side, an example of a low interaction honeypot would be one like RDP Honey. So these honeypots are designed to send a response back to an attacker indicating that they've connected to, say, an RDP service. But as soon as the attacker attempts to interact further with the service, the packets are logged and the communication is immediately terminated. In reality, a lot of these honeypots actually exist somewhere in the middle. I mentioned earlier that Cowrie, you know, is a high interaction honeypot, but things like Dionea, they serve up a lot of services. They have some functionality built in. You can run commands, but they're not going to fully emulate, you know, the service that honeypot is serving. So, you know, you can kind of use a mixture of these in your environment, depending on what type of data and intelligence you're wanting to collect. So the STINGAR project relies on a mix of, can you go back? Sorry, Richard.
Oh, sorry.
No worries. The Stinger project relies on a mix of publicly available open source honeypots, as well as honeypots developed in-house by the Stinger team to mimic specific servers or vulnerabilities. For example, last year when the F5 Big IP vulnerability was announced, we were unable to find a reliable open source honeypot to use with Stinger, so we created our own. One issue that we found after years of running honeypots was the process involved with provisioning new hosts, installing the honeypot software, and configuring these honeypots was relatively time consuming. So somebody had to log into the server, get everything built, get everything configured. It was by no means a fast process. So therefore, our goal with the Stinger project was to streamline the deployment of honeypots as much as possible. So we decided to leverage Docker containers for these new honeypot instances. This greatly simplified the installation process and even allows the automation of honeypot deployment. So if you've got already have some automation tools, continuous integration tools, you can use those to spin up new honeypots. I would say a full deployment of Stinger along with the honeypots can typically be deployed in under an hour. We've seen some installs take as little as 15 minutes. Next slide. So the core goal of Stinger is to share threat intelligence with other participating partners in real time. For this, the Stinger project uses the collective intelligence framework. As events are captured by Stinger honeypots, these raw events are forwarded to a messaging queue called HP feeds. An intermediate container responsible for normalizing and extracting these indicators reads the honeypot messages from HP feeds and extracts those indicators. The indicators are then checked against a Redis caching database and forwarding to CIF. So whenever we see a new IP address, we'll check this Redis database to make sure we haven't seen it in, say, the last 5 minutes, 10 minutes. If we haven't, we'll go ahead and send that to CIF. This intermediate piece really exists to prevent, if we see continuous connections to the same honeypot from the same IP address, that we're not trying to send the same indicator over and over and over to CIF, potentially overloading it. Next slide.
And Alex, just really quick, we got a question here from Martin. How many indicators do we typically have live at a time in the feeds? What kind of indicators are they, and are they categorized?
So I think Guggen will get to that
okay.
a little bit later. If not, happy to provide that as well. But we do log some type of metadata about those attacks. So with the threat intelligence feeds, you're not necessarily going to see like which honeypot they hit, but you will see the honeypot type that they tried to connect to. So this can provide a lot of information about, if they're hitting a Cowrie honeypot, it's probably SSH. If they're hitting a big IP honeypot, they're probably attempting to exploit a known vulnerability or log into that admin interface. Next slide. Oh, no. Okay. So similar to submitting indicators to a central repository, we also wanted a way for organizations to be able to block these indicators in real time. For this, the Stinger project relies on the BHR project out of NCSA to implement black hole routing. So much like the earlier process, events are read from HP feeds, normalized, the indicators are extracted and then checked against a Redis database before submission. These indicators are then submitted to BHR via API call. It can actually do this in bulk. So if you get hundreds of indicators that you want to submit all at once, it'll roll those up and make that one submission, greatly improving the speed of getting those blocks in BHR. Using this method, we're really able to block indicators within 1 to 2 seconds of a connection to a honeypot. So given the potential for blocking an IP that may be a false positive, we employ safe lists on the router that handles black holing, as well as within the HP feeds BHR process and in BHR itself. So generally we maintain 3 different safe lists. The first one will be in BHR, that's typically our wider safe list, and then down to the router itself, we'll usually safe list our own IP ranges to prevent if somebody hits one of our honeypots from inside the network, that they're not going to get blocked. So given the potential for blocking an IP, we implement safe listing. We found with this architecture that we can maintain a block list of roughly 400,000 indicators before the performance of that router really starts to degrade. So you can get a lot of indicators in BHR using this method. Next slide. So another aspect of Stinger that we wanted to focus on is the ability to prototype and build new types of honeypots. So the first method that we used for developing new honeypots relied on an open source project called UHP, or Universal Honeypot. This project allows the developer to define behavior files in JSON or YAML format. So you can build out response trees to emulate various network services. It even supports simple responses to HTTP queries. So this is great for network services such as SMTP or FTP, applications with a fairly finite set of commands and predictable responses to those commands. However, as the complexity of the application increases, also does the complexity of the config file, and it can grow exponentially. Also, handling the edge cases for those applications can become untenable. That being said, UHP is usually still our first stop for prototyping out new services, especially for low interaction honeypot. So the config file structure is relatively simple, and a working prototype can generally be created in under an hour. Next slide. For some honeypots, we wanted more realism and high interaction than offered by UHP. This was especially the case for web-based honeypots, such as the Big IP honeypot or medical device honeypots mentioned earlier. For this method, we used the burp intercepting proxy to capture request and response history for these services by manually browsing to the site and interacting with any forms on the page. This history was then used to reconstruct the behavior of the sites. So the response pages were copied off, and a Flask application was built to serve pages using more or less the same behavior and headers returned by the actual server. So one advantage of this method is it provides a great deal of granular control over how the data is presented and which events are logged. We were also able to get it relatively undetectable from the actual service by fine-tuning these honeypots. However, this is an extremely manual process. For a simple login page with limited functionality, functional honeypot prototype could be completed in a couple of hours. However, for a more complex system, this method could take days or weeks to fully construct the server in a believable fashion. So taking what we had learned in our previous custom honeypot development cycles, we defined some criteria for rapidly developing new honeypots. We needed a method for prototyping these honeypots in an automated fashion. Given the time between when new vulnerabilities are announced and attackers begin exploiting these services, we wanted a much faster way to prototype these. We also needed a method for building both high interaction and low interaction honeypots. So when targeting specific exploits, we need the honeypot to return believable responses to common requests and exploit strings. We also needed standardized logging for Stinger. By standardizing the logs, this greatly simplifies both how we generate the events as well as how we normalize and extract data from these events with containers such as hbfeeds.sif and hbfeeds.bhr. The process needs to be simple and quick to use with default integration with Docker for building Docker images and containers as soon as the prototyping process is complete. And then finally, we need these honeypots to be virtually indistinguishable from legitimate services. This is a very difficult goal to achieve, but is critical for detecting more of these targeted attacks. So this leads us to our current research in honeypot development. So this technique is primarily focused around the emulation of web servers, as we found these are often the most complex and time-consuming honeypots to prototype. Also, we found finding reliable existing honeypots for these servers can be difficult. So this technique uses captured HAR files for building out the profile and structure of a site. So HAR files are JSON files that record all of the requests and responses captured by the web browser while interacting with a site. So the researcher begins by interacting with the site in a browser as a normal user would, and then when complete, we'll save this HAR file off for analysis and processing. A set of tools then reads this HAR file, reconstructing the structure of the site and extracting all web files and content. It also records common responses to requests, including header and cookie information. This extracted structure is then used to build out a working skeleton Flask app for serving up the site. This process can reduce the initial prototyping from several hours to several minutes. Finally, the honeypot prototype uses logging middleware to capture all requests to the server. This can be fine-tuned to report on certain request methods, hits to specific paths, or matching parameters to reduce logging noise. There will most certainly be some required tuning and customization on the way content is served from the honeypots. However, using this method to build out a rough application greatly simplifies the process of constructing a new honeypot application from scratch. And the ultimate goal of this is to incorporate spidering or web scraping to further automate the data collection piece. And now I will turn it over to Gagan to talk about the data.
Thanks, Alex. So coming on to the data section, what happens when an attacker targets our organization? What kind of data are we talking about that Stinger helps you capture? Generally, they'll scan for open ports and vulnerabilities, and that's where actually Stinger comes in. Since the honeypots are hidden to your outside world, there should be no legitimate activity on the sensors. And since all access is allowed due to the configuration or misconfiguration, all scanning and intrusion attempts on your network automatically get logged. This includes commands, URLs, usernames, passwords, file hashes that enable you to observe different attacker patterns. And you may also use it to alert new types of scanning that can correspond to some kind of a remote access vulnerability. Analyzing this data can also help you improve your data collection strategies. For example, you could deploy more suitable honeypots based on your network landscape, probably at more strategic locations. And you can ultimately turn all of the threat intelligence into a workflow for relevant reporting, or as Alex mentioned, maybe integrated with your existing security tools to enable automatic blocking. Next slide. So I want to talk about the analysis in these four different areas. We'll see how the Stinger data provides relevant feeds, how it helps you understand the threat landscape, what are the benefits of sharing data due to the network effect, and what kind of data are we collecting that can enable research use cases. So when we say highly relevant feeds, at a glance, next slide, This is the sort of an overview of the coverage that we are talking about. So Stinger data is already a repository of 300 million threat events that have been collected from 29 partners that have shared real-time threat intelligence. And it covers 241 countries and almost 25,000 unique network owners or ASNs around the world. We'll dive more into the landscape in the coming section. But before that, I want to talk about the feeds. So threat intelligence is only good when it's relevant. And it's only relevant when it comes at the right time. So evaluating these feeds for your organization really depends on what your network infrastructure looks like and what risks are unique to your industry. So this makes the percentage of unique and new data in a threat feed really important metrics. Some paid feeds in the market are just an aggregation of free feeds. So there's a lot of duplication and you're just paying for curation, which is why, percentage of unique data is kind of an important metric. And also, how long is the data relevant for? Is it relating to a specific immediate activity in a similar environment, or is it of a more strategic intelligence based on long-term trends? So not all of these feeds or these sources may be relevant to your organization. And most often than not, similar data from organizations in the same industry might be more relevant. Next slide. This slide is showing an attack trend that we see from Stinger data over the past 3 years, starting from December 2018. If you look closely between March and June 2020, around the time of COVID, there's a slight dip. And this might be contrary to some other universities that experienced higher attack activity during COVID. But since Stinger data, this data repository is really a representative of higher education. We saw a dip that can be investigated, through look-back searches, as Richard mentioned. And you can also notice towards the end of the year, as restrictions started to ease, we actually reached a peak of activity, which was higher than pre-COVID levels. And we saw a maximum of around 100K unique threat actors in October, November. And since then, the activity has slowly stabilized until the start of this year. Now, when you look at the average number of unique IP addresses that Stinger sees, it's around 40,000. And out of those, around 15,000 are new every day. So by new, it means that those IPs are seen for the first time ever in Stinger. And your ability to capture these new IP addresses basically reduces the risk of being attacked, because when partner A has seen a particular IP address, partner B is actually able to block that IP address before it can even reach partner B's network. This really highlights the relevancy and uniqueness of Stinger threat feeds. Next slide. So as I mentioned, this data also helps us build a better understanding of our threat landscape in terms of where the attacks are coming from, what are the top countries, what are the different ASNs that are targeting your network. In this slide, you are looking at top countries, first by the total number of unique actors. So in the red, you can see that Vietnam and China are the top countries and account for most of the unique attacks that we see. And below that, the graph shows top countries by the total number of ASNs that are present in a country. And you can notice that Brazil is the top country that has the most number of risky ASNs, and which is actually more than the total number of ASNs in Russia and US combined. Another interesting point to note here is if you look at the dot, the marker for US, the number of ASNs in US versus China, there's a huge difference. The reason is that China's internet is highly controlled and largest providers are mostly state-owned. So the bulk of bad IP addresses are concentrated in the largest ASNs. On the other hand, if you contrast with the US, US has around over 16,000 ASNs. China has just 580. So in the US, the risk tends to be more distributed across different ASNs. Next slide. So looking at some slides that show the network effect and how the partners are benefiting from using the Stinger data. I have some snapshots from the kind of intelligence reporting that we develop at Duke. So this first snapshot is comparing the metrics at Duke versus Stinger overall. You can look at on the rightmost, 34% of all the IP addresses that were captured at Duke were new, whereas in Stinger it was 23%. And this is for the over a period of last month, June 2021. So this is another snapshot from the same report that compares your threat landscape on the left with overall Stinger. And it's really focusing on the top nation states, Russia, China, Vietnam, Brazil, and Iran. So if you notice here on the left, for the last month, Russia seems like is a top country in terms of attacks, while for overall Stinger, we see more attacks from China. So this kind of reporting can be developed for all partners where they can review their landscape and compare it with an overall Stinger benchmark. This slide this is a lot of information. It's comparing top IP addresses for two different partners. On the left, it's interesting to note that the top countries include Armenia and China and Hong Kong, while on the right, for the right partner, the top countries were Canada, Singapore, China, and Brazil. This view shows the top IP addresses that were common among all partners. So for example, it's interesting to note that this first IP address, the hostname R&D group ib.ru from Sekels, was seen by 16 partners last month. There's another hostname Piri something from Turkey. And then if you look at the 9th indicator, it's an IP address from MIT that was seen by 14 different universities. So this slide is a case study that we did in May this year to measure how Duke is benefiting from the data collected at from Stinger. When we looked at all our blog data from our IPS, we saw that around 75% of the attacks that were blocked based on Stinger were seen first by other partners. So other partners saw an attack first, shared that data with Duke. Duke saw the same IP addresses and was able to block before they could hit our network. So this graph really highlights the local applicability of threat feeds among higher education institutions. The next chart shows the increase in number of unique IP addresses, unique bad actors that we've been able to capture with increase in number of partners. There was almost a 6-time increase identified over the last year, with a peak of 80,000 unique indicators, with a maximum of 80,000 unique indicators this year. So around overall, around 20% of all of our IP addresses are seen by at least more than one partner. So on the right, you are seeing a visualization that shows the attacks that were seen by multiple partners and who saw it first. On the left, you see the partner that saw an attack first. In this case, partner 1 saw almost 20% of the attacks first. And on the right, the same attacks are also seen by the partners that are mentioned, that the Sankey is coming onto the right. So if you look at the number above the bar, 6.81, so this shows around 7% of attacks were shared between partner 1 and 11. So this really highlights that visualization is actually interactive. So it allows you to analyze the contribution that each partner is making and how partners on the right are actually benefiting from the data that they are seeing from other partners. So this slide is related to the last slide. It's showing the time distribution in hours within which an attack is seen by another partner. So this is showing a range of 5 to 24 hours, meaning that most of the attacks that were seen by two or more partners were seen within a single day. So this highlights the importance of sharing attacks real time. Last but not the least, I want to show what samples of what kind of data Stinger is collecting that can be used for further research. So the data is capturing activity information like usernames, passwords, and commands issued. This information can be used to support security research, or your security teams identify issues that require system or network layer improvements. As you can see, the maximum number of times the name root was used, and on the right with the password admin. And there's lots of interesting accounts and password combinations that you see, that some may also hint towards a human activity and not just a coordinated attack or a botnet. In the next slide, you can see some sample commands. So this data, like commands and URLs, can be used to identify new patterns, also in characterizing the types of attacks, or support your incident response activities. You could also apply machine learning techniques to leverage. You can leverage machine learning techniques to categorize these attacks into groups that share similarities and classify attackers. This data can also be used to classify all of your traffic into normal versus malicious using various anomaly detection techniques. And this marks the end of the data section and this presentation.
Yep. So, let's see. We'll open it up for questions now. Martin, I think we may have covered the kind of the questions you have as far as the indicators and the numbers involved. Guggen, just do you happen to have handy, per day about how often or how many new
Right.
per day are showing?
Yeah, so if you go to slide 29.
Yep. 29, there we go.
Yeah.
Yep, there we are.
So in the lower bar, yes. So the first is total events in the month. Second is average daily total events. Third is average daily unique IP addresses. Fourth is average daily new, and then there's a percentage.
Yep.
And just to touch on that point a little more, Martin, when you asked about the types of indicators being logged. So, we have a couple of different ways of capturing those indicators. I would say to the central repository at the moment, we are only capturing IP addresses. However, we have been exploring expanding that to files and URLs that are used to download toolkits and other applications. So we need a little more work there, but it is on the roadmap to start incorporating some of those as well for ingestion.
Okay. Let's see. Michael is asking, can one ingest the threat feeds without having to deploy the honeypots? The short answer to that is yes. There's probably a slightly longer answer that Alex may be able to explain on that, but yeah, we see the benefit as far as if folks are going to participate in this, it's useful to have both, right? It's useful to have something that's gathering data that's being shared back with the community, as well as retrieving the feeds.
Yep, and just to echo what Richard said, that he's absolutely correct. You can ingest the feeds without running Stinger or honeypots within your own environment. But you also lose out a little bit because you're not getting some of those indicators that may be targeting your network specifically. So, if you have honeypots running as well, not only are you getting the community feed, but you're also getting things that may be specifically targeting your network. Yeah,
and there's benefit to this. I mean, we've had a couple of examples where when new partners have deployed this, it hasn't been the external data that has been useful to them. It's been the fact that the honeypots picked up something going on internally that pointed to a compromised machine that was attempting to move kind of east-west across the network, and the honeypots picked up those initial recon scannings where they were trying to find the next hop that they were going to use. And quite frankly, that's something that we have found useful, that particular use case. So, it's something to keep in mind. Can be done, but you lose out on some useful information from your end. Let's see, Catherine is asking, any advice on how frequently Stinger identified IP addresses should be aged out of network blocks or black holes? Alex, can you speak to kind of what we do?
Yeah, sure. So, I think it depends on your environment and how you have it set up, but I can speak to how Duke does this. So we use BHR kind of as the first step of blocking, so we can get things into BHR really fast. So, at top performance, we're talking sub-second for some of these blocks. So generally, we use BHR as a buffer before we can get those IP addresses into our IPS. So our IPS can only refresh the feeds, on cycles. So it's like every 15 minutes, say every 5 minutes, they're able to pull in those IP addresses. So what we do is we block those in real time with BHR, and we block those for, I believe, 60 minutes. And that gives our IPS enough time to pick up that feed and start blocking. Once it's in the IPS, we generally block those for 7 days.
Okay. All right. And I while we're waiting on other questions, one of the things that we probably should have shared on here, and we did not do, if you're interested in learning more about this, let me bring it up and I'll share it with you. You can visit stinger.security.duke.edu. Go set this up so you can see it real quick. There we are. And, for what it's worth, you can, visit it. We do have a place for joining the mailing list here. And also we've got information on the different versions and the different work that's going on there. So if interested, highly encourage you to visit it and take a look. And if you'd like to learn a little bit more, obviously happy to talk to anybody about it and help you get started with testing things out.
Would you like to throw that URL into the chat? Because it's not very legible on the screen.
Absolutely, happy to. Oops, let's go to analysts and attendees. All right, there we go. Okay. All right, well, not really seeing any more questions here. So just want to thank everybody for your time today and joining us and listening to kind of our journey here. Big shout out to the ResearchSOC team and our partners here. This has been a great partnership as far as being able to fully develop this and support not just the research teams, but also higher ed teams. And with that being said, Karen, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Richard and Gagan and Alex. It's been wonderful having the three of you speak to us today from Duke. So we thank everybody who participated today and the questions that you all asked. And I believe that's about all we have today. You can find more information on the ResearchSOC website, including past and coming webinars and events that may be of interest. Again, thank you for your attention, and this concludes today's webinar.